entire life, believe it or not, has been about control. Not in a domineering way, but in a quiet, methodical way. I control variables. I isolate pathogens. As an epidemiologist, I chart the chaotic, terrifying spread of a disease until it becomes a predictable pattern. A dragon I can map and eventually slay. It's what I'm good at. It's why I came back to this forgotten little town I once called home. I left a big, important job with a national research institute, fancy labs, proper funding, decent coffee, to set up shop in the old public library here, surrounded by the smell of dust and decaying paper. Because something was making people sick, and no one else was coming. I told myself it was my duty. I told myself I was the only one who could get to the bottom of it. That's the story I gave everyone, anyway. Dr. Arifa Khan, the brilliant hometown girl, returning to save the vulnerable. It wasn't a lie, not really. My work is everything to me. I see the world in infection rates and patient zeros. It's a language I learned to speak so that I would never, ever be helpless again. This town, with its peeling paint and its deep, quiet forests that seem to swallow the sound, it's in my blood, and I couldn't stand the thought of it being wiped out by some mystery illness while I was miles away, publishing papers on less important things. My goal was simple: find the cause, create a treatment, and stop the spread. Be the protector this place never had. Be the person I needed when I was a child. It all comes back to Assad, my little brother. He was 7 when he died. It wasn't some complex, terrifying disease. It was a simple case of bacterial pneumonia, something that a single cheap round of antibiotics could have fixed. But we were poor, and the only clinic in town was understaffed and dismissive. They told my mother it was just a flu, to give him fluids and wait it out. I remember sitting on the edge of his bed, the room smelling of fever and old wood, holding his small, sweaty hand and watching him struggle for every rattling breath. I felt so small, so powerless. It was like watching someone drown in their own bed, a few feet from shore. In that moment, watching the light fade from his eyes, I felt a rage so pure and white-hot it scared me. It was a vow forged in grief and helplessness. I would learn the science, I would understand the enemy, and I would never again stand by while something I loved was destroyed by neglect. That agonizing powerlessness became the engine of my entire life. That's why my deepest fear isn't just death or even disease. It's the loss of control. The absolute terror of being a prisoner inside your own mind, watching your body do things you don't command. To have your hands, these hands I've trained to be so precise, so steady, move with a will of their own. The thought of becoming a puppet, pulled by the strings of some dark, primal thing inside me, that's the stuff of my nightmares. It is the horror of becoming your own monster. And it's a horror I'm starting to think I didn't leave in my imagination. Last night, I was working late, staring into my microscope at a blood sample from the latest victim. My eyes were burning, and the low, constant hum of the generator was the only sound. I felt a tremor in my right hand. I put it down on the table, flexing my fingers, telling myself it was just caffeine and exhaustion, a logical explanation. But then the tremor became an impulse, a clear, undeniable command that didn't come from my own thoughts, like a jolt of low-voltage electricity. My hand reached out, slowly, deliberately, and swept the entire tray of carefully prepared slides off the table. They shattered on the concrete floor, weeks of painstaking work gone in an instant. I watched it happen, a silent passenger in my own body, my mind screaming, "No, stop!" But the command was ignored. And as I stared at the glittering mess on the floor, a cold dread washed over me, far colder than any fever. It wasn't just that it had happened, it was that a part of me, a dark and unfamiliar part, had wanted it to. A deep, nihilistic satisfaction echoed in the back of my mind. I realized I couldn't stop it. The next morning, I tried to pretend it was a dream, a stress-induced nightmare. I swept up the glass, my movements stiff and overly deliberate, focusing on the simple, controllable task. I told myself I'd just work harder, remake the slides, rerun the tests. But the feeling of being a spectator in my own skin lingered, a foul taste in the back of my throat. I tried to call my sister, Yasmin, just to hear a familiar, grounding voice. My hand picked up the phone, but instead of dialing her number, my thumb scrolled to my old boss from the Institute, Dr. Al Jamil, and hovered over the call button. I felt a sudden, powerful urge to tell him I'd made a mistake, that I was in over my head, that I was coming back. My mind recoiled in horror. No, don't. You can't abandon them. The thought was a shout in my head. My thumb trembled, fighting a battle I couldn't see, a war between my own will and this foreign impulse. After a long, agonizing moment, my hand spasmed and dropped the phone onto the desk with a clatter. I stared at my own palm, at the faint lines and calluses, and it felt like I was looking at a stranger who wanted to run. A coward.
I needed to see my family, not just for comfort, but to prove to myself that the world outside my lab was still normal, that this was a problem contained within my own exhausted mind. My mom was out for her weekly grocery run, but Yasmin was home from her classes at the community college. I found her in the kitchen, and the sterile, scientific part of my brain immediately started cataloging symptoms. She was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, and her eyes, her bright laughing eyes, were hollow and dark. She was staring at a bowl of uncooked rice on the counter, her body unnaturally still. "Yasmin?" I said, my voice softer than I intended. Her head snapped toward me, a jerky, disjointed movement that made my stomach clench. And then I saw it. Her hand, moving with that same slow, deliberate alien purpose as mine had the night before, reached into the bowl. She brought a handful of hard, dry grains to her mouth and began to chew, the sharp, unnatural crunching sound echoing in the silent kitchen. But her face was a mask of pure terror. Tears were streaming from her wide, unblinking eyes as her own body forced her to eat. She was in there, trapped, a prisoner at her own table. My training, my entire life's work screamed at me to act. This wasn't some vague town-wide sickness anymore. This was my sister. This was Assad all over again. I lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, trying to pull her hand away from her mouth. "Yasmin, stop! Stop it!" The strength in her arm was shocking, unnatural for a girl her size. She didn't fight me, not consciously. Her body just resisted, a machine with a single horrifying purpose. The look in her eyes was a silent scream for help. I saw my own deepest fear reflected there, and I knew rational thought had left the building. My methodical brain shut down, replaced by the raw animal panic of a big sister watching her sibling get devoured from the inside out. My only thought was, I have to fix this. I will not be helpless again. That night, I went back to my family home with the medical kit. It was a monstrous breach of ethics, of everything I stood for, but I didn't care. I was an epidemiologist, yes, but first, I was her sister. I told myself it was just a blood sample, a simple draw to analyze back at the lab to find the pathogen I could map in Slade. Yasmin was asleep, her breathing shallow, her face still etched with that silent terror even in slumber. The house was quiet. I crept into her room, the syringe feeling cold and alien in my hand. I knelt by her bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found the vein in her arm, my movements practiced and sure, a small island of control in a sea of chaos. But as the needle was about to break the skin, her eyes snapped open. They weren't her eyes anymore. They were wide, black, and utterly primal. In one impossible, fluid motion that defied the jerky awkwardness from before, her body coiled and sprang. Her hand, not the trembling hand of a sick girl, but the iron-hard grip of a predator, shot out and clamped around my throat. I was thrown backward, my head hitting the floor with a sickening crack. Pinned beneath me, I wasn't looking at my sister. I was looking at a puppet. Its strings pulled by an insatiable hunger, its face frozen in the horror of its own actions. And the conscious part of her, the real Yasmin, was in her eyes, crying, screaming, begging me for help as her own hands tightened their grip, ready to kill.
Air became a luxury. My vision started to tunnel, the edges turning a fuzzy, sparkling gray. But the true horror wasn't the suffocation. It was the view. I was staring directly into my sister's soul, a terrified prisoner watching me die at her own hands. I saw every flicker of her agony, her silent, desperate pleas. My survival instinct, a primal thing, separate from thought, took over. I bucked my hips, throwing her weight off balance, and scrambled for the syringe I dropped. My fingers closed around it just as her body lunged again. I didn't aim, I didn't think, I just thrust the needle deep into her thigh, my own hand now a weapon against her. She didn't cry out. The thing controlling her didn't even seem to notice. But the real Yasmin, the one trapped inside, her eyes widened in a fresh wave of agony. Her body seized for a moment, a brief, violent tremor, and then collapsed beside me, unconscious. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, the taste of blood in my mouth, and listened. The silence of the house was gone. From outside, through the thin walls, came the sound of the town tearing itself apart. It was a symphony of repressed ugliness. The quiet grocer who always overcharged was now smashing his own shop window, his body methodically hurling canned goods at anyone who came near. His face was a mask of rage. A woman I'd known since childhood was walking down the middle of the street, laughing a high, manic laugh, while her hands tore at her own hair, pulling it out in bloody clumps. There was no screaming from the victims, only the terrified whimpers of the witnesses trapped inside their own bodies. It was an orchestra of primal chaos. I had to get out. They had to get Yasmin out. I managed to drag her, a dead weight, into the bathroom and lock the door. For hours, I just sat there on the cold tile, listening to the cacophony, my scientific mind trying to piece together a puzzle whose pieces were soaked in blood and madness. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. A low, steady drone, growing louder. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in my chest. Planes! Someone had seen. Someone was coming to help. I scrambled to the small bathroom window. 3 large, unmarked cargo planes flew in low formation over the town, sleek and gray.
It didn't matter. They were here. We were saved. A fine, almost invisible mist began to drift down from their wings, shimmering in the oppressive afternoon sun. People in the street below stopped their violent, disjointed movements. They looked up, their puppet bodies frozen, their trapped eyes wide with the same desperate hope I felt. But I knew better. My blood ran cold. I recognized the aerosol delivery system from my time at the Institute. It was a method used for the rapid, wide-scale deployment of not a cure. The mist settled over the market square, and then the silence came. It was sudden, absolute. One moment the air was filled with anarchy. The next as if the world's sound had been switched off. Every person in the street below simply stopped. Then, like marionettes whose strings had been simultaneously snipped, they fell. They didn't crumple or stagger. They just dropped. One moment standing, the next a heap of limbs on the dusty ground. No convulsions, no final screams. Just a clean and efficient and utterly silent extermination. The government had sent a cure. They had sent an eraser.
I felt nothing. The part of me that could feel horror or grief had been scoured clean. I was a hollow shell, filled only with a terrible crystalline understanding. I stumbled out of the bathroom. The house was still. Yasmin was standing by the bedroom window, her back to me. She was perfectly still. Yasmin, my voice was a dry rasp. She turned, and for a glorious, heart-shattering moment, it was her. The virus, the hunger, the puppet master, it was all gone. Her eyes were clear, lucid. They were the eyes of the little sister I had promised to protect. And they were filled with a terror so profound, it would haunt me for the rest of my days. She knew what was happening. She saw the bodies in the street. She looked at me, her mouth opening to say my name. But no sound came out. Her body went rigid. The life, the fear, the love, it all just vanished from her face, leaving a blank, empty mask. She stood there for a long second, a perfect statue of my failure, before toppling sideways onto the floor with a soft, final thud. I didn't move. I just stood there, watching the red dust from the street begin to settle on her still form. And I knew why I hadn't been affected by the aerosol. My security clearance, the standard inoculations I'd received at the Institute for working with weaponized bioagents. I was immune. This wasn't a tragedy I was a part of. It was an experiment I was designed to witness. My idealism, my fierce need to protect, my vow at my brother's bedside, it was all just a variable they had counted on. They needed someone with my skills on the ground, someone who would try to solve the puzzle, someone who would document the vector and the transmission, someone who would confirm the efficacy of their monstrous creation. I was not a doctor. I was the final page in their lab report. Now, silence is the only language this town speaks. I walk the streets alone, a ghost in a city of the dead. The sun beats down, baking the vibrant colors of the market stalls into faded, muted pastels. A fine layer of red dust covers everything. The overturned carts, the scattered produce, the bodies that lie where they fell. They look like sleeping children, their faces peaceful in a way they never were while the virus had them. I am the sole survivor. But survival is not a victory. It is a curse. It is my prison.
My entire life was a reaction to that moment of agonizing helplessness beside my brother's bed. I built a fortress of knowledge, of control, all to ensure I would never be that powerless little girl again. And what was the result? I was forced to watch my sister die, just as helpless as before. My deepest fear was of becoming a puppet. And in the end, that is exactly what I became. Not to a virus, but to a system so cold it used my own soul against me. They pulled my strings, manipulated my grief, and turned my driving purpose into the instrument of my damnation. They left me alive, a conscious mind trapped in a body that is forced to walk these silent streets, forced to see, forced to remember. My freedom to die with them was taken from me. I have lost all sovereignty. I am a puppet whose strings were cut, left to stand alone on an empty stage after the final horrific act. And I can't stop. I can't stop walking. I can't stop seeing. I can't stop remembering.
Thank you so much for watching or listening. Like and subscribe for more nightmares. Your support keeps the darkness from consuming this channel, so we can face the next terrifying story together. Don't be left in the dark.